Pardon me. Take two. Welcome to Nikos, and I'm Jonathan Albin, your host. And today's Game Master's Toolbox is chock full of things we need to talk about concerning monsters. Before we get into that, we're going to go ahead and ask you to push the little buttons down below so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
As you know, pardon me. As you know, I constantly am involved in. Well, let me start that again. Take two on this section. I'm going to have to edit the crap out of this. All right. As you may know, I'm a game master with over 50 years of experience, and today we are in a world where things like role-playing is something that's in the back of mind. People are aware of it, but it doesn't mean that they are in particular interested or involved in it. And I think we're looking at a situation where our world has shifted and we have sort of lost our moorings. And I think I'm going to be able to make my case for that as we go through this subject. Monsters are a term, just the very term monster, we know culturally what that is supposed to refer to. It's those things that are abhorrent, generally damaging or destructive, and that generally take away life, liberty, and so on. And the term monster has radically changed in terms of its application, even in the environment of roleplay. And I'm going to be presenting evidence that not only does this change alter the way we think, but it also changes the way we play. So let's start back in the past. We're going to hop in our Wayback Machine and go back to the 1970s. Now, when I say go back to the 1970s, the reality is I'm just talking about going back into the past, into a way of thinking that is far afield from where we are right now. When you think of classic monsters, and by that I mean old monsters when I was a kid, there were very clear evidences that the monster, at least in literature and in, therefore, roleplay, were by nature dissociated from living sentient beings. They were monstrous. They were we were unable to understand why they did what they did. We didn't comprehend what their purpose was. We saw them as being intentionally destructive and not having a thought process. Monsters were the way you carried forward a story. Dracula was a foreign idea, the idea of something that was undead, something that had the appearance of life but was not dealing with the very life and death situations that the average person has to deal with. They were particularly vacuous in rationale. You couldn't talk to them. You couldn't interchange with them. Even in those cases, for example, in the motion picture Dracula, the conversations were stilted. Even the language didn't seem quite the same. Now, in the story, of course, the character of Dracula is a being that is centuries old and has no concept of reason whatsoever other than survival. And then the question becomes, does the quote love relationship between Dracula and his former spouse actually translate to Mina. And I'm not going to get into all the lore, but the point is that we utilized monsters as simply something to be engaged with. The classic game Munchkin catches this portion of this nuance of classic old role play games very clearly, that you kick down the door, fight the monster, take its loot. The method for storytelling, therefore, was to try to link the objects, these monsters, with a locale and a story, and therefore they were simply a plot device, a mechanism for evoking change in the story. Now, granted, there were earned experience points and those kind of things involved with that, but it literally was a mechanism for storytelling. It was not a situation where the monster had to be considered in its biosphere. You didn't consider whether, are there children for the orc or whatever. The idea is that the monster simply filled a purpose within the game of driving the story. This changed, however, over time, partially because the game masters became more sophisticated, but it was also because the persons selling the game's properties were looking for additional material to fill out the pages of the documents they were creating. And I would argue that there were people who were actually considering and being concerned with the species involved. If you look at the direction, for example, that the plot, the Pathfinder goblin takes compared to the classic Dungeons and Dragons goblin, or even the goblins of fantasy and fantasy literature and culture. The concepts of the monsters started to change over time. Additionally, game masters would often use the monster as a way for them to exert their opinion or their position upon the world in a way that the players would therefore interact with and grab a hold of and turn and consider. So they were fundamentally surrogates for the storyteller in the game to convey information. It wasn't every monster, although I do know game masters who would allow creatures that normally didn't have voice to actually speak and therefore act as the surrogate. But by and large, therefore, the concept of the orcs that were raiders or the centaurs that came down from the north, raiding and pillaging and taking prisoners, these things all were still fundamentally acting in the surrogacy role because they were carrying forward the story in such a way that the players would want to get to know them a little bit better, to understand a little bit more about them, and so therefore the lore about the creatures became part of the story. As you may recall, early Dungeons and Dragons fundamentally gave you the parameters for the monsters, what their weaknesses and strengths were, but that was the by and large description of them, and it was only in the later monster manual and later volumes thereafter that actually would start to give some information about their metaculture and position in the life cycle, so to speak, of a region. This, of course, itself adapts over time because the more you get to know about the being and the more you're interacting with them, the more human they become, the more sentient and aware they become. So now we move into the more classic period of Dungeons and Dragons, and they're talking about the concept of the monster as a trophy. And this generally applies to your bigger monsters, the group targets. In the classic sense of the smaller monster, the man-like or roughly human-sized beings, the surrogacy role falls apart because the massive number of opinions that are perpetrated by individuals can color, therefore, the culture. And so it wasn't as important to follow what was going on with the monsters that were simply not communicative or were more vicious and, well, monstrous. The concept, therefore, became what today they call, there's a new property called Monster a Week, and the idea here is that you're looking for trophies. You're looking for something to hang your hat on in terms of property that you've defeated. And so you could literally have, as in World War II, the painted emblem of each kind of monster on your shield so that they'd be silhouetted so that you could say, well, I've killed 4 dragons and 3 manticores and 2 hill giants. The idea is that the monster becomes a trophy, and this becomes a talking point for players to discuss what happened in the game sessions they were involved with. As more and more books came out that were usable to be monster lists, whether it be the Monster Manual, Fiend Folio, Creature Catalog, these all gave ways for you to just tick off that you've fought every kind of monster, and so then therefore the characters in game became trophy hunters, and that worked for a while until the access to the monstrous books became so common that they were no longer interesting individually, and therefore they again started to adapt and evolve into different forms. Now, because of the mechanism that was built into Dungeons and Dragons and other role-play games, the idea of the monster as a loot box, as a source of sheer economic revenue became understood. Earlier Dungeons and Dragons didn't put an experience point value on the collection of treasure, or reverse themselves, I should say, because the idea of gaining loot was not necessarily associated with the monster, and it seemed like an imbalance between the two. And so when the game master started to apply the idea of multiple monsters in a region, or the very idea of the dungeon delve that was multiple levels of adventuring underground, the monsters became the checkpoints economically and the checkpoints for experience. And so they were now devices. They were no longer perceived as something to be discussed with or conversed with, I should say. They instead were just simply a resource to be capitalized upon within the games. And this idea of the monster as loot box is still retained today, as in Munchkin. You get benefit of adventuring levels, and therefore the concept of loot now shifts. Instead of looking at it from the standpoint of what kind of an economic gain can we get for bringing down the monster, instead now it's the monster is a one-to-one relationship with the advancement of the character, and so running over them now became a matter of perfunctory nature. There was no longer an incentive for the storyteller to give the monster a personality or a voice. This concept, therefore, of the characters gaining benefit for destroying the monster meant that they no longer worried about what the monster was, how it affected them as a person, because they were no longer afraid of them. Instead, they were perceiving of them as the threshold advancing mechanism. So you knew if you defeated the monster, there was going to be an influx of experience points. If there was an influx of experience points, you could start winning at the roleplay game. You were no longer dealing with the internals of trepidation, whether or not characters were going to die, because that was also slowly being eroded because the players were holding on to their characters week over week and month after month, and desirous of keeping that persona because it was their scoreboard. It was the player's mechanism for advancing, and they no longer were really. Now, I should have put a disclaimer on this video. This isn't going to apply to every game master across the board, but I'm talking about the zeitgeist of the time. The idea of the monster as an experience point also tended to associate directly with, for example, the fact that there were sequelized movies. Now we're looking at, Friday the 13th, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And the idea is that the advancement of the players as a group and, as more importantly, as individuals, was now associated with their defeat, not with their interaction. As a matter of fact, the very rules of role-playing games at that point had only begun to talk about the idea of earning experience for resolving the conflict rather than actually defeating the monster. So at this is, I guess, the high point of the victory points mechanism for the characters, because now you were having to kill the monster. You had to take it out of the action. You had to remove it from the scene. You had to save the community, and that itself was the attempt to win the adventure. Of course, clever game masters already had kind of seen the writing on the wall, and we were looking at the use of a monster for its material components. The idea is that the animal is made up of things, the creature is made up of things, and for example, if we have discovered that there are such thing as displacer beasts, now we can take that displacer beast and process it somehow and make it into a displacer cloak. We can actually utilize the microcosmic, and as we do so, we're ironically phrased, dehumanizing. We're taking down the barrier. A monster, if it's an unseen other, and we have to drive it back and protect the community, those elements that were victories without the death of the monster now have been pretty much replaced with the idea of the death of the creature. So now that the creature is a physical thing that can be encountered after the fight, now the monster becomes a resource, so we can actually start to consider what the elements might be. This was also when the idea of the spellcaster as a collector of material components. This is, the characters are getting up in levels. Now we want to be able to hold on to the trophies, but now in realistic ways. So people were looking at taxidermy inside of the roleplay game, the idea of keeping pieces or parts or all of the creatures that they defeated and utilizing them in innovative ways. The story becomes more sophisticated because you're now working beyond the end of the quote fairy tale. It's not just defeating the dragon, but now it's okay, I've got 700 square meters of dragon skin to use, so why don't we make tens of suits of armor and start to gain benefit from the victory after the victory. And this change, therefore, the mystique of the monster is dwindling. We're not seeing them as something to be engaged with for the benefit of actually engaging with them, but instead we're looking at them as tools for our advancement yet again. When it was realized that the monsters could be defeated, could be treasures to us by defeating them, they became speed bumps. They were no longer, it was not, the adventures that were being written were no longer the story of find out what the monster is, hunt the monster down, kill it, and save the village and rejoice in that. Instead, it was, okay, we want to get to the item. Generally, stories of this kind were parallels or copies of you, if you will, of the Lord of the Rings storyline, that there was a item of wondrous power, whether a sword like Excalibur or the ring of Sauron. The idea that the monsters that you engaged, since they were no longer a threat because the game masters were reticent to actually kill players, it leads to a bad feeling when you take away somebody's toys. And so the idea of death prevention within the game became paramount, and so therefore the monsters that were thrown at them they might have been lethal if they'd been run as if the game master was fighting against the players, but by this time the GM as enemy or GM as villain has started to dwindle. When you're running a longer tail game, the monsters can't be ultra lethal because your story will have discontinuity as you're having to keep adding new characters into the game, even as you hold on to your players. Therefore, the monsters become speed bumps. They just are things that stand between the players and their objective, but they're no longer seen as true opposition. They're not something that's going to be taking away the player's agency. They're not going to be, there were adventures that were written as, prison breakouts and such, but those were situations where the players had to provide hand-wavium on their part to allow that even to happen, because the idea of player agency being paramount was rising, and therefore the monsters could no longer be a true adversarial threat. Instead, they simply became speed bumps. Well, with this being the case, pretty soon the very idea of the monstrous is now in question. The game master, who's now read fundamentally the majority of the properties that are out there about different monsters, know what their strengths and weaknesses are, but now they're becoming flavor text. The players know that they have to defeat blah blah, and then they're going to get a chance to fight the median monster. And I believe this also is associated with video game advancement, because now you are looking at the mechanism for role play very differently. Because of the video game marketplace, you know that there is a big bad evil guy at the end of the story, that there are lieutenants and other bosses in between, so the bosses and sub-bosses and the sub-bosses. They create flavor text only. They're no longer, you're not concerned with the darkness of the monster. As a matter of fact, many players were starting to embrace the idea of picking up monstrous attributes by allowing the monsters to, a vampire could bite me. Okay, great. Now I get the benefit of turning into a cloud of mist or a group of bats. I gain instead of I lose, because the very concept of how deplorable and how dark monsters had been is gone. It's been erased, partially because the games no longer stay within the Terran realm. You're starting to see the advancement of different world builds and such, where the nature of monstrosity has changed. That doesn't mean the monsters don't still exist, but now they've morphed, and fundamentally they've become the sentient other, not necessarily the game master as a surrogate, because you're not seeing the game master as a threat, but you recognize that the villain in the story himself is going to be the thing that has to be destroyed or interacted with. But this concept of the monster as flavor text evolves when we're no longer really worried about whether or not we defeat the monster. We can now avoid it, stick it in a box, whatever we need to get it out of the way of our story. And therefore now it's just a matter of waiting for the game master to muddle through his description of what they are, and then we can, as players, wave them away. And it's now to the point that monsters are noise. We're advancing the characters, and we're worried about the character builds. We're looking online at the methodology for a character build based on a rule set, because we are no longer invested in the game. We're now concerned primarily with the player advancement, what they can get out of it and why. And therefore, if we have to go and defeat X monster, okay, well, we'll go and that'll be the adventure. But even within that, we're going to be looking at the story, not from the standpoint of being what the game master is providing, but instead we're looking at it from the standpoint of what do we get out of it. And although we will mouth the words, or we will, use descriptions, maybe even use miniatures to define them, they are fundamentally chaff in the wind compared to what we're trying to do, because we are looking at the game from a success mechanism instead of the idea of story. We're no longer in the story, we're now above the story and looking at it from the standpoint of noise. As a matter of fact, I only know a few players who have lost characters in any game in the last 6 to 10 months, or even 6 to 10 years. The idea is that the character advancement has now moved beyond even considering the dark nature of the monster, because we have either lightened the world so that the monsters are no longer dark, or we've made them safer because we don't want to endanger the players' characters, because we fundamentally can't do that because we want to keep them enjoying the games. So having said all of that, as my grandfather said, I told you all of that to tell you this. The idea is that we as a culture have gotten to the point where there are no monsters anymore. Let's look at this from the meta situation. In my childhood, the very concept of World War still loomed. My people my grandfather's age and my great-grandfather's age had been in the war, or were aware of people who had been in the war. And as time moves away and you move away from conflicts that are truly threatening, the world no longer bears anything to keep us fearful. The idea of, for example, stranger danger was more prominent when people were not as directly interlinked as they seem to be today, even though we still have those that do harm to culture. It's now changed. It's no longer the possibility of a threat of an individual monster in your life. It's instead the idea of what could be in terms of mass killings. And this changeover also is somewhat adjusted by the amount of information that was available. When there was no internet, if we didn't have the ability to go and look up what Lechuza monster might have as its skills, if we didn't know what its modus operandi was, there was mystery, there was fear. But our culture also began to look at the things that had been monstrous and give them more clear definitions. So, for example, when we talk about individuals who are troubled, back in my childhood, the idea of somebody who was talking to themselves on the street, or acting weird, or walking funny, that was all unknowns. We didn't have, the idea of the modern ideas of mental illness, mental health, which have fundamentally cut off at the knees many of the things that had been monstrous, and have given a definition that causes perhaps pity or understanding, at least an idea of empathy with those that have these difficulties. And instead of seeing a person who talks to themselves as someone who is perhaps having truck with demons, or reaching different levels of insanity, we instead just simply recognize that as something that could be handled by medication. And the loss of these dangers has put us in a place where there is no longer the depth of fear. Add to that the fact that the very concept of religion and piety and the concept that there needs to be a saver of our souls has fundamentally done away with many of the things that make us fearful. Now, you notice I said the return to reason is my parting shot. And I'm going to say that my return to reason here is actually nuanced, because the idea of reason here is that the reason for fighting monsters is still there. The idea that we need to stop the monstrous. Sure, in today's very, very aware world, we can take on those dangers in different ways. But in terms of role play, you have to literally begin to actually return to the idea of the reason you are playing. If you are playing a role play game to capture the nuance of what it might be like to have lived in a time when the monstrous could actually destroy your soul, and the idea that individuals can be monstrous, then you have to embrace that and play in that environment, changing in your imagination what you are doing and living within that framework. It's unfortunate that the world has shifted, but the concept of using the monstrous as always being irrational or always being isolated and antisocial, that doesn't necessarily have to be. We can actually look at the concept of monstrous in terms of the villain not having to have reason, but that the players therefore should still have to be considerate of what their actions will do to the world. So I want to thank you for being here. I've wrapped that up. We will talk about more in the next episode. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and this has been the Game Master's Toolbox. We'll see you next time.